News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali on TV1.
And a very good evening to you and a very warm welcome to Newsline Special, a recording with, wait for it, members of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Finally, the IMF are here to answer your questions. We've collected a number over the last couple of weeks, and hopefully we will give you some answers to the questions that you've been searching for. And tonight, with an exclusive interview for News First through Newsline, we have with us, starting from the far corner, so to speak, is Peter Brough, who is the Senior Mission Chief of the IMF for Sri Lanka. And in the middle, we have Mr. Masahiro Nozaki, who is the Mission Chief for Sri Lanka. And here we have Sarwat Jahan, who is the resident representative of the IMF in Sri Lanka. Very good evening to you, Sarwat, and to you gentlemen. And welcome to News First Newsline. We're terribly obliged by you being here. Thank you. And Peter, I thought I'd ask you straight away, in fact, I'd ask all of you here, could you explain to our audience why is the IMF important for Sri Lanka at this moment?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for having us here and having the opportunity to speak to you and your audience. Sri Lanka entered a significant crisis approximately a year or a bit more than a year ago, with essentially being cut off from international financial markets, with the government's funding running out and reserves running out. And it is really at this time that the Sri Lankan government approached the IMF to see whether it could help. We engaged in considerable discussions for the next few months until we reached staff level agreement on September 1st. And these discussions were really about how to address the underlying root causes of the crisis. And so that's what the economic program that the authorities have committed themselves to with the help of the IMF is all about. It's first about restoring fiscal sustainability, to have a fiscal, a revenue mobilization, because really that's where Sri Lanka falls short. That fiscal revenue mobilization and fiscal consolidation is meant to also be accompanied by strong social safety nets and by a reform of fiscal institutions. So that's the first part. The second part is restoring debt sustainability. As I mentioned, debt became unsustainable. It's important for the country to be able to borrow again, and to do that, it needs to restore sustainability. So that's the second important part. The third one is price stability. So as the government lacked sources of funding, it turned to the central bank as a source of funding, and that resulted or contributed to a large extent into significant inflation. To restore macroeconomic stability, it will be important to get inflation under control. So we have negotiated a multi-pronged strategy to address that. As a fourth pillar, it will be very important to safeguard financial stability in this economy. And then finally, also structural reforms that help the country get back on the recovery path, and that would include governance reforms, anti-corruption measures that essentially help, macro-critical economic governance, and also help obtain the buy-in by the population at large. So it comes, these are all very significant reforms that are happening at this time. And it's really important that the country comes together to support these reforms so that it can emerge from the crisis as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Peter. Mr. Nozaki, perhaps I could ask you to clear some of the terminology. We get a lot of requests for clarity on our program. So perhaps you could tell tell the audience what the difference is between restructuring, a haircut, and the coupon, a cut in the coupon rate, and so on. All sort of terms which the public are not entirely familiar with. Would you be able to tell us?
Okay, maybe I can try. First of all, thank you so much for this opportunity. It is a great opportunity to engage with you and people in Sri Lanka, so appreciate that. Okay, terminology on debt restructuring, it's quite technical. But when you lend some money to your business partner, your counterpart, you determine interest rate. Okay, how much you lend to this person or company, and then at what interest rate, and what is the duration of the loan repayment. So changing this term is so-called debt restructuring. And there are several ways to do this. One is to extend maturity of the loan, or two, reduce the interest payment or interest rate, or three, reduce the amount that the person lend to the other person.
So that's
this
the
is the that's a haircut.
Okay.
Here I'd like to highlight that IMF is not the party of loan agreement between Sri Lankan government and its creditors. So we are not party to it, so we are not responsible for determining the terms of restructuring. And this is prerogative of the authorities, or this authorities in charge of how to design the terms of restructuring. We are here to help, but perhaps we can elaborate a bit more on this. But that's hopefully that clarifies terminology on the
thank you,
restructuring.
Mr. Nozaki. Thank you very much. And could I ask you, Sawat Jahan, who is the resident representative of the IMF here in Sri Lanka, what is expected from Sri Lankans, as opposed to the government, but from Sri Lankans as a nation for this 17th time round IMF program to work? What's expected of the people of Sri Lanka?
Thank you, Faraz, for the question. And I'd like to I'm very thankful that we are here to answer some of these questions and clarify what we, the fund, can do, but more so what Sri Lankans as a nation needs to do to put the country back on its track.
Right.
So for us, the way we see it is that this crisis is a bit different from previous crises that Sri Lanka has faced.
Okay.
This crisis is quite deep. It's a combination of economic crisis and humanitarian crisis. And Sri Lanka has never faced debt sustainability issues before. This is the first time that Sri Lanka has announced a moratorium on its debt service. So the situation is actually quite grave, and it's going to take quite a bit of effort on all to bring Sri Lanka back to its growth potential. Mm-hmm. So for Sri Lanka as a whole, I think the main part is to recognize how deep the crisis is, and then for all Sri Lankans to contribute to the recovery, which means taking ownership of the deep reforms that is needed. And those reforms, include tax reforms, SOE reforms, and also structural reforms, things that can help build institutions so Sri Lanka is never in this situation again. For example, ensuring the independence of the central bank, or even dealing with anti-corruption issues. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a holistic approach.
Thank you, Sawa. Back last year, when on the 12th of April, when the government sort of announced that they would be unable to service their loans and make repayments, and in essence declared bankruptcy. How deep was that bankruptcy? Was it really, did we had Sri Lanka reached rock bottom? We had no reserves? Is that what it all means?
Well, it is a significant crisis. I think the finance minister at the time spoke about the reserves that Sri Lanka had left, and that conveyed the picture of how deep the crisis is. And in fact, subsequently, the country experienced what it was like. There were hardly any reserves left to import essentials, petroleum, food, medicine, there were extreme shortages. When I arrived here for the first time in June last year, I could see in the middle of the night miles-long lines of cars and tuk-tuks and buses that were all queuing up at petrol stations to get petrol. And these were just the visible shortages. There were so many invisible shortages for food and medicine. So it was significant. And now, almost a year later, we got to experience Sri Lanka a little bit even outside Colombo, and it is already a turnaround. Clearly, the crisis is still very significant, that's for sure. But in terms of activity, there are the first signs of change, at least in terms of the daily life on the street. But no doubt the crisis continues to be very severe, and hence the need for these economic reforms and to persevere with them for quite some time.
In an almost sort of perverse way, does it mean that this turnaround you've just spoken about, and which the public will also appreciate, the fact that there are no fuel queues or gas shortages and so on. In an almost perverse sort of way, do you think that this has come around because the economy has now shrunk and there is less demand? Do you think that's why we are able to manage with the little that we have?
No doubt, the economy has shrunk a lot, 7.8% last year, and continues to shrink, unfortunately, this year. And clearly, that has dampening impact on demand. There's no doubt about that. But there are other things that are happening at the same time. There's a certain degree of confidence coming back in the sense that the exchange rate, for example, has appreciated since mid-March. Around the time of the IMF Executive Board meeting, the exchange rate has appreciated. The central bank is able to rebuild reserves as a result of flows coming in. So there's a certain degree of confidence coming back. Also, prices are now more in line with what is the market price. For example, on fuel, fuel pricing is now based on a cost recovery basis. So it is bringing demand and supply closer to one another, and inevitably with less of a subsidy, it means that there's less fuel consumed, as the consumer of fuel now has to pay the actual price of the underlying good.
Talking about pricing and so on, Mr. Nozaki, what of the farmers? Now we understand the logic of cost recovery pricing in terms of fuel, but what about Sri Lanka? Is mainly agro-based economy. We have a large farming community. And the farming community, the wind was really taken out of their sails. One, because of this sort of overnight move to organic farming, which is not sustainable, but more so about the availability of fertilizer. It seemed to us, to the public, that this was a bit too much of a coincidence, that on the one side the government announced that they're moving to an all-organic farming method, and at the same time almost saying that we don't have much dollars left. So, the public obviously make the connection, but what about the farmers now? Right now, fertilizer remains a challenge for most of the farmers. They simply can't afford to have all the fertilizer for all of their land. They may have a little bit of fertilizer just for maybe 1 hectare, but not for the others. So their lives too shrinking, like the rest of the economy. But in Sri Lanka, the farming community is amongst the poorest. What do you say to them? What can you say to them that will give them a little bit of hope at the end of this very dark tunnel?
Thank you. This is a very fundamental question. Maybe let me address one by one. So first of all, cost recovery pricing for fuel and electricity is important because otherwise somebody will have to pay for the differences. If the sales price of fuel and electricity is lower than the actual cost, somebody has to bear the cost. And then that cost has been, in many cases, borne by the government. And then it will eventually go to the public's burden. And research shows that, in many cases, fuel subsidies goes to relatively rich group of the people. So the better way to provide subsidies or support is more targeted to vulnerable and poor families, and where this importance of social safety net reform comes in. I will defer to Salvat perhaps later on that point. And second, this is a very difficult situation. I feel really, my feeling goes to the suffering of the people in Sri Lanka because of, I have seen, including this TV program, I have seen many footages of people having trouble because of economic crisis. Exchange rate has depreciated significantly, and then, as Peter said, inflation is quite high. So in these circumstances, important thing is macroeconomic stabilization. You will restore prudent fiscal policy, prudent fiscal position, debt sustainability, and prudent monetary policy and stable inflation. This macroeconomic stability will help everyone and make sure that the inflation will not run away. Inflation will soon go to mid-single digit. That's a policy objective. So that will benefit everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Nozaki. And thank you very much for the questions that were sent across to me by WhatsApp in the last few days and so on. Some of these are what I spoke to somebody this morning who told me that the people are suffering. There is no dal, that's lentils. There is no milk powder, or there's shortages of. Petrol and diesel prices remain unaffordable, and there's no medicines. We have to rely on donations, some of it, and of course gas is another problem. We seem to have it now, but there's no confidence. What this person told me on the phone today is it would be true to say that it's replicated right across our society. Perhaps not so much in urban, in say Colombo, but a little bit out of Colombo, you get this and a bit more. What can the government of Sri Lanka, what can the government of Sri Lanka do now that the IMF have given a form of a support? We know that the IMF isn't here to solve all the problems, but you're giving the country support. What do you think that the government can do to lessen the burden on these people, bearing in mind that 62% of our workforce are sort of daily waged, and only 38% are in secure employment? Bearing in all that in mind, how can the government help?
You know, I live here in Colombo, so I get pretty much a first-hand account of what's happening. I've gone to the grocery stores during the past 6 months that I've been here, and I see the increase in prices, and I see people having to select, do I buy this or something else? And even the place where I work, I have colleagues there who tell us that, you know, prices have gradually increased, and a lot of them are facing these problems. For example, school buses, the fares there increased, things that people did not expect before. So I know there's a lot of pressure here on the people of Sri Lanka, and it's not just one. There's inflation, there's tax rates, high interest rates, and so there's pressure from all sides. But what I would like to point out is that this is where economic stabilization is very important. If you have economic stabilization, first, there will be price stability. Prices will gradually come down. If you take away the uncertainty that exists in the economy now, interest rates will also come down. So I think with a gradual phase of stabilization, a lot of these pressures that the people are facing now will resolve itself. But on top of that, we also know that some segments of the population are disproportionately, they feel the pressures more. The poor and the vulnerable often do not have buffers to cope through this crisis. And here is where we think that the authorities or the government can actually do quite a bit more. In the IMF program, one of our central pillars is to ensure that during this reform phase, the poor and the vulnerable are protected. We have discussed with the authorities to ensure that the 4 major social spending on cash transfers have a minimum spending floor. And I think that is a very important target to meet. We have set spending floors on 4 major cash transfers, and these will continue throughout the program. And so we think that having adequate coverage, adequate money to help the poor is an important goal. But also what we want to emphasize is not only having coverage, but also better targeting is an essential component. So the authorities have set up a social safety net, a social registry, which is quite dynamic. And there people were asked to register who believe that they are vulnerable. There's been a data validation, and we think that this will help better targeting, better coverage, and better adequacy of social spending.
As a rule, does the IMF office in Colombo have a way of monitoring the outcome of these sort of programs?
Well, what we like to call is, we talk to the authorities. We look at what the targets that we had discussed with the authorities. And in fact, if you look at our staff report, you'll see that we have targets for every quarter set up. And of course, then when the time comes, we discuss with authorities about whether these targets have been met. And actually, that's when our reviews come into place. Prior to every review, we look at the targets, whether they have been met, because only when the targets have been there's been progress on the targets, can we then go to our board for the release of the next tranche. So yes, there's constant dialogue with the authorities on these targets.
Thank you, Sawat. And on that note, let's go for a quick break and take a peek at what's due in the next hour or so. But in the meantime, when we come back, we'll be asking the members of the IMF team who are with us for an exclusive interview as to how Sri Lanka is doing in terms of the first review coming up. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali on TV1.
And warm welcome back to Newsline Recording. We are in conversation with the team from the IMF. That includes Peter Bro, who is the Senior Mission Chief, and Mr. Masaharu Nozaki, who is the Mission Chief, and the Resident Representative, Sawat Jahan. And welcome and thank you for choosing News First to be on this program, to send out your message to the people of Sri Lanka. I'll pose this to all three. Somebody can pick it. Doesn't the IMF imposed fiscal consolidation make matters worse?
So yeah, I'll take on that question. I
Thank you very much.
have worked on the fiscal issues in Sri Lanka for several years, and I came to understanding of Sri Lankan, how the fiscal system in Sri Lanka works. I'd like to point out that many of the problems you faced during the crisis stem from the fiscal policy, and then in particular weakness in revenue collection. I'd like to point out that in 2021, the Sri Lanka's government revenue was only 8% of GDP. GDP is national income, Sri Lanka's as a whole, how much income it received, and then only 8% of it went to the government. On the other hand, government expenditure was 20% of GDP. So 20% of income what's spent by the government. The difference we call fiscal deficit was 12% of GDP. In all ordinary cases, this is very difficult for the government to finance. And this sort of fiscal mismanagement has led to very high public debt. Public debt was around 128% of GDP before the crisis, which means that the country's debt is more than income of the country, and it's very difficult to sustain. And then actually it was unsustainable. That led to eventually the Sri Lanka lost access to external financing, and banking system in Sri Lanka was not able to finance such a large fiscal deficit. And that led to central bank financing of budget deficit. People call it money printing or rupee printing to finance fiscal deficit, which is not very good, actually very bad for macroeconomic stability, because it will eventually lead to inflation and exchange rate depreciation, which has happened in Sri Lanka. So the root cause of this is to improve fiscal revenue. As Peter mentioned in the beginning, the IMF supported program has a first most important pillar of revenue-based fiscal adjustment. This is the measures we agreed with the authorities try to resolve this fiscal revenue problem by progressive basis, meaning that the tax reforms should be getting more contributions from high income earners to the extent possible. The fiscal consolidation, fiscal adjustment will have negative impact on the poor and vulnerable families. Mm-hmm. And that will be taken care of to the extent possible by the social safety net reforms, and then minimum spending floor on the social safety net. So this is how we discussed with the authorities and formed into the program.
So you said IMF imposed.
Yes.
I would take a slight issue with this, in the sense that what is the alternative if there weren't an IMF program? The IMF provides financing to support the government. That reduces the amount of money that the government needs to find in the market, as Masahiro mentioned, which leads to even higher interest rates, or needs to get from the central bank, which leads to this ever-increasing inflation, which everyone is feeling at their purse strings, or it needs to reduce its expenditures and consolidate on the expenditure side. So all three of these options are not desirable options. And by providing some financing, the IMF cushions the blow that this crisis is dealing to Sri Lanka, and at the same time commits the government to a credible set of reforms that help the government emerge from this crisis.
So it's not really IMF imposed, but it's you say to the government, well, you know, if you want our money, we think this is what you want to do, but you make the decision if you want to take it or leave it.
Except for we don't approach the negotiation like that. No. We engage in a dialogue with the authorities.
Far more polite than I've just said.
Well, we listen to the constraints they have, to the things that they know about the Sri Lankan economy that we don't. And in this conversation, solutions emerge that benefit from the input from all sides, from both of these sides, as well as other experts whom we consult, and stakeholders whom we have consulted throughout our missions here to Sri Lanka, who bring in different perspectives and different ideas that matter as well.
With 8% of GDP in terms of revenue collection is abysmally low, isn't it, for anyone?
It's among the lowest in the world. Yes.
It's amongst the lowest in the world. How do you encourage the government to collect more money? Do you all, when you all were looking at Sri Lanka's case, did you recognize an ability, if maybe a lack of commitment, but did you recognize an ability to actually increase collection? Did we have the systems in place?
So Sri Lanka, and Masahiro can come in on this as well. He worked on Sri Lanka for a long time. But as you remember, there was a significant tax cut in 2019.
Yes.
So Sri Lanka actually collected more, even though tax collection, revenue collection has been a problem for a long time. It used to collect more taxes as a share of GDP than it does at the moment. This tax cut resulted in a large number of taxpayers essentially leaving the tax net. And so the number of taxpayers shrank significantly. In fact, in one of our papers, we have a number from 2019 to 2020. It's of the order of 30% or so. And
less tax files.
Less tax files. And I understand that trend continued thereafter. So bringing people back into the tax net to make their fair contribution in line with what they can contribute to society is a crucial part. Because after all, the government is there to provide essential services and to support the poor and the vulnerable. And so those who can most afford it should pay their fair share to contribute to the government so as to help others who are in a less fortunate positions. And so that's what we're working with the government to achieve.
When maybe I could ask you, Sawat Jahan, who is of course the resident representative of the IMF here in Sri Lanka. When it comes to looking after the poor and the vulnerable, how confident are you that these measures that are being put in place now will actually work?
Thank you for that question. And again, I would like to iterate that crisis is bad for everyone, but especially for the poor and the vulnerable who do not have enough buffers to get through the crisis. The stabilization policies that we're looking at will have multiple effects, right? The first impact will be that on price stability. Inflation will hopefully come down, and we have already seen inflation coming down. And we know that inflation is the worst form of taxes there is. It impacts the poor significantly. So the stabilization policies will help all, including the poor and the vulnerable. The second part that I had mentioned a bit earlier is about social spending. In the program, the authorities and we have agreed on a spending floor, on cash transfer schemes, and we have also discussed that the cash transfers should be better targeted. So it does cushion the impact on the poor quite a bit. And then, as Masahiro and Peter had mentioned earlier, when we had looked at tax policies, we had ensured that it is progressive. And what that really means is that the higher income households do pay more taxes, and they should pay their fair share. So we think the combination of these three will actually help the poor get through the crisis and see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Another question that came about was, in a shrinking economy and with many of our corporates experiencing a downturn in business, doesn't this then affect the amount of taxes that they are able to pay? How does that then work with the need to increase this 8% to much more?
That is difficult part. I would like to say that this revenue-based fiscal adjustment will have economic impact, negative economic impact on Sri Lankan people. And then important thing, first of all, is to ensure that the poor and vulnerable people are shielded from negative impact of the crisis and also from these fiscal adjustment measures. And the second thing is that I would like to highlight again is that macroeconomic stability, low and stable inflation, and international reserves restored and rebuilt. These are important foundations for economic growth, and that will help Sri Lanka to raise more revenue as well as reduce their debt.
So, why is there consolidation in such a terrible crisis? Essentially, when you're out of buffers, you have no other choice. There is nothing you can turn to get out of the crisis. There are very few options that you have, because accessing the markets in such a situation when debt is not sustainable is impossible. So in order to gain back the confidence of markets that will lend to you again, to bridge such a difficult situation, you need to take the first step and start restoring fiscal balance. So it's unfortunate that people will only lend to you when things are looking better. Mm-hmm. But except for the IMF, that is here to help in the worst of all times. But then once things start getting better and the creditworthiness of the country improves, it should then be a lot easier to access markets again, to avoid overly tightening the fiscal when it has harmful impact on the population.
Can I ask you also, just while we're almost on it, in say the past 10 years, has there been any other country in the world which has gone for an IMF only solution as a last resort, really, that has worked? Has there been any other country in the last 10 years that's gone for what Sri Lanka has done now?
Oh yeah, I mean there are plenty of examples where programs where countries have committed themselves to the reforms that are supported by the IMF have been very successful. I myself, I was resident representative in Ireland. It's a different economy, I recognize that, but it's a country that committed itself to very strong reforms and was very serious about ownership and implementation. Those were really key parts of the reform program in Ireland. They really followed a model of under-promise and over-deliver, and that provided positive surprises that really helped to regain confidence of the markets, regain confidence of the people, and resulted in a successful program. And there are plenty of other examples I'm sure my colleagues have worked on.
Peter, what is the checks and balances that the IMF has to look to see if the Sri Lankan government, its people, are delivering whether they're on target? Is there a continuous monitoring process?
There is indeed, yes. In fact, that's, if you wish, part of why we're here now. So there are regular reviews that take place. In the case of Sri Lanka, it's twice a year. The first review is to take place around September or October, when we come back and formally do what you just said, to consult with the authorities, to see how things are going relative to what has been agreed, and then there would be another review 6 months later. But we are in constant contact with the authorities. Sarwat, of course, is here. It's her daily life. We have continuous video conferences with the authorities, and periodically we come for visits that are not tied to these formal reviews, but that are a more informal way of catching up with the authorities. And that is the purpose of the current visit here in Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much. And on that note, let's take a quick peek at the headlines for this evening from our wonderful primetime news team up there, led by Zulfik Fazan. And we'll see you on the other side, where we are in conversation with members of the IMF team here, Peter Brewer, Masahiro Nozaki and Sarwat Jahan. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali on TV1.
And welcome back to Newsline Recording. We are in conversation with members of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, in an exclusive interview to News First via Newsline. Welcome back. And could you, I don't know who's going to answer this, but what about growth enhancing reforms? What about that?
Yes, maybe I can answer that question. growth enhancing reform is important for Sri Lanka. Obviously, because we discussed lots of fiscal adjustment, impact on the economy, how to protect the poor and vulnerable. However, once economic stabilization, price stability, debt sustainability is achieved, it's now turn focus on growth enhancing reforms. In Sri Lanka, there are some areas that people can look at. One is trade liberalization. The trade protection is very strong in Sri Lanka. So reducing trade protection with the proper compensation for affected groups would be able to prop up growth. Second area is improving business and investment climate that will bring in lots of investment, including from foreign direct investment. So these reforms should be also focused once economic stabilization is achieved. We also are coordinating very closely with colleagues in the World Bank and ADB, Asian Development Bank. They have even more expertise on structural reforms on growth enhancing area.
And talking about the ADB and the World Bank here, there's a question there. Will those loans that they've made, will they also be subject to a potential haircut or readjustment? Or are those loans not negotiable?
So I can take this. So from the debt restructuring perspective, it is up to the authorities and their creditors to discuss how the debt relief should be distributed. Having said that, it's been a very long tradition in the international monetary system that the multilateral development banks and international financial institutions are not subjected to a debt restructuring. It would fundamentally change their operation if that were the case, right. Because these IFIs essentially lend at low rates to countries to support their development. These MDBs have a very high credit rating because they have the guarantee by all their members, 180, 190 members for the international organizations, maybe a little bit less for the regional ones. And if they were to take losses on their loan portfolio, their credit rating would drop. If their credit rating drops, that means they need to themselves pay more when they borrow from the market. They would need to pay a higher interest rate, and they would no longer be able to lend to countries at low interest rates. And so their business model would be entirely undermined. So it's unlikely that they would participate.
We received another question as well, and that was to, in some economies, the theory is to maximize the employment, the job market, and then control, if you need to, control inflation thereafter. But in Sri Lanka, how can that be possible? Because we are in a shrinking economy, and the IMF prediction itself is a growth rate of about 2 to 3%. How does this work? Does it mean that the people of Sri Lanka are going to have to wait even longer for those opportunities, those real employment opportunities come up again?
So I think right now, I mean, the economy is shrinking. As you had mentioned, the IMF projects that there will be another contraction this year, but it's the magnitude that's changing, right? As I had mentioned that I've been in Sri Lanka now for 6-7 months, the confidence is rebuilding, right? When you have confidence rebuilding, investment will start to flow, job creation will be added automatically. And I think that's the important part, that investors have to regain the confidence in Sri Lanka. And that, I think, will lead to more job creation, new businesses. And I've also seen that Sri Lankans are very resilient. They have gone through a lot in the past year, and yet there's optimism everywhere. So to build on that, to help, wherever you can, to be, in many cases, continue to seek opportunities that will generate more jobs.
Thank you very much. I'd like just to say, as we come to the end of this program, this exclusive interview with members of the IMF, I'd just like to say to all of you, to Peter Brewer, to Masahiro Nozaki, and to Sarwat Jahan, all from the IMF, on behalf of the Capital Maharaja Group, thank you for what you're doing for the country. Thank you for having chosen our network, News First, to come and share your thoughts with and answer some of the questions from the public. And we hope that you'll keep an eye on Sri Lanka, because the people of Sri Lanka most certainly will be looking forward to that. Thank you very much for being on Newsline.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And that's the way it was on Newsline recording with Peter Brewer, Masahiro Nozaki, and Sarwat Jahan, all from the International Monetary Fund, for an exclusive News First interview on Newsline. Take care, have a great evening as much as you can, and God bless you all.